Every year, roughly 40 million American women get a mammogram.
This is all about finding breast cancer early and all the new and improved treatments combining to save lives.
And the machine they use is something almost no one thinks about. But if you looked at the logo on the machine, you might be surprised to find that about 70% of the time, it says Hologic, not any of the giants like Siemens or GE that have spent decades supplying the world's hospitals with top-of-the-line equipment and who continue to dominate the rest of the industry. No, it's Hologic, a company that didn't even exist until 1985, a company that started out making nucleic acid tests and bone density scanners, and a company that, for most of its early life, nobody in radiology really thought all that much about. How does that happen? Let's start with a very well-known manufacturer, GE, founded all the way back in 1892, partly by Thomas Edison himself, and who, over the following century, became one of the most diversified industrial companies in American history. Jet engines, power turbines, locomotives, and medical imaging equipment. If GE Healthcare made a piece of equipment, hospitals knew there was a reputable name behind it. In 1985, a new company was founded, Hologic. They first appeared when they got FDA clearance for a nucleic acid test. 2 years later, Hologic pioneered the DEXA market with their QDR system, creating today's gold standard for bone densitometry. Today, however, Hologic controls more than 70% of the US mammography market, and GE, Siemens, Philips, they're all sharing that last 30% of the market. So here's what actually happened, and why it's still playing out 2 decades later. In the early 2000s, the mammography industry was moving away from analog film scanners into digital, and that's where everything began to shift. GE released its first 2D digital mammography unit, the Senograph 2000D, in the year 2000, but it came with a catch. You see, previously those analog units had interchangeable buckies that worked for nearly all patients. However, GE's new digital unit only included one smaller bucky for all patients, leaving some vulnerable to getting double exposed to radiation just to get a complete image. Not ideal. 3 years later, Hologic came out with their first digital mammography machine, the Selenia, and they launched it with a large detector right out of the gate. That meant it worked for patients of all sizes, no double exposure required. GE didn't offer a large bucky option until 2007. That's a 4-year window where Hologic was simply the better clinical choice, and radiologists, clinics, and hospital systems noticed. Okay, I need to cut in right here. There is one thing that bugged me while I was recording this, and it's the realization that I still don't know how a company jumps from nucleic acid tests and bone densitometry to suddenly being not just in the mammography field, leading it. Did they guess at how to build their own machine and just stumble on to having the best tech? Of course not. Back in 1999, GE was the worldwide mammography market leader, but hot on their heels in the US was the Lorad brand mammography systems. Hologic wanted to get in on this market, so they acquired Direct Radiology Corporation, or DRC. And that was a big deal because with DRC, they got Direct Ray, their proprietary digital flat panel X-ray detector tech, intending to build their own units in-house. Only 1 year later, though, in 2000, Hologic was able to acquire Trex Medical Corporation, who, despite owning Lorad Mammography, were suffering from corporate mismanagement, and they were filing for bankruptcy. So as I mentioned, in 2003, Hologic came out with their first machine, the Selenia. Well, that's how. It was from the merged technology and brands they just acquired. Okay, so it was some aggressive and well-timed acquisitions that launched them into the mammography industry, and it put them ahead as the whole industry was shifting the first time. But that's not how they stayed on top.
Now, a new 3D test could improve accuracy.
It's called tomosynthesis.
The 3D mammogram also reduces the number of women called back when a result is unclear.
So it's going to help us both find more cancers and decrease these number of false positive callbacks.
Right now, there are about 100 centers in the tri-state area with the 3D equipment. But because many experts expect it will become the standard of care, that number will likely increase.
I think that 3D mammography will become the screening tool of the future. I think it's important that women get the message that if they're going to have a mammogram, they should make it count.
The real turning point came in 2011 when Hologic received FDA clearance for the Dimensions, their 3D tomosynthesis system, or 3D mammogram. This was a genuine leap forward for the industry. No more two-dimensional scans of a three-dimensional human.
What digital tomosynthesis lets us do is actually open the book and look at pages of the breast, one page at a time, each being a millimeter of breast tissue, so that we can actually peer into the breast tissue in a much deeper fashion to separate normal from abnormal and get a more accurate diagnosis.
Meanwhile, GE's answer was a field upgrade to their existing 2D Essential unit. It was not well received. At the time, many in the industry described it as clunky. And GE didn't release a true, purpose-built 3D mammography system, the Pristina, until 2017. That's a 6-year gap where Hologic owned 3D mammography essentially unopposed. For all of those years in between, a compounding effect started taking place. Once a hospital bought Hologic, they tended to stay. When they needed another unit, they bought another Hologic. When it was time to upgrade, they upgraded to the next Hologic. As Hologic's install base grew, so did that ecosystem. I should note that early on, there was a real clinical concern about 3D mammography, specifically around radiation dose. If you're running a full 3D scan on top of a separate 2D exposure, you're giving the patient more radiation. That was a legitimate issue. Well, Hologic addressed it directly with their proprietary FDA-approved C-View software.
Now, there's an even newer FDA-approved 3D technology called C-View. C-View is a computerized imaging system that eliminates the need for additional images through 3D mammography.
The greatest advantage of C-View is the low dose.
They generate a synthetic 2D image directly from the 3D scan data, which means there's no need for a separate 2D exposure at all. The result is a radiation dose that's comparable to a standard 2D mammogram, but you're still getting everything 3D has to offer.
A return visit and another mammogram proved there was no cause for concern. But like thousands of women each year, Poozer had to handle a very frightening experience. A screening that looks like cancer, but really isn't. Now, new 3D technology could lower those false positives by 20 to 40%.
Women probably won't see much of a difference between this new 3D mammogram machine and the previous one, although it is larger, takes a few seconds longer, and you'll be asked to hold your breath twice while each picture is taken. But the real difference is in the results.
According to a landmark study published in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the 3D exam paired with 2D imaging detects an average of 41% more invasive breast cancers compared to 2D alone, and it reduces callback rates by 15%. A recent study by Mercy Medical Center said it's even higher, more like 40% reduction in callback rates. So now we know there were 4 years where Hologic was the only digital mammography unit with the larger Bucky option. Then for 6 years, they were the only true 3D mammography machines offered right out of the gate. By the time GE and other OEMs caught up on technology, and they did, the Dimensions isn't the only quality 3D mammo on the market now. Hologic had built a loyalty flywheel that was hard to compete with. GE and others were late to the game, and the infrastructure just wasn't there comparably the way it was for Hologic. But Hologic wasn't done, and this time, their advantage had nothing to do with equipment.
The bad news is that it's not always covered by insurance. At least not yet.
When 3D mammography was first introduced, being that it was a brand new procedure, there was no billing code for hospitals in the United States to indicate that they'd used it for their patients' care, which meant hospitals weren't going to get reimbursed for using tomosynthesis in their facilities. Every medical procedure in the US has its own standardized CPT code, or current procedural terminology. Think of a CPT code as a serial number for specific healthcare procedures. Knee replacements have a code, x-rays have a code, a regular 2D mammogram has a code. When the hospital submits the bill to the insurance company with all the related CPT codes, they're then reimbursed accordingly by the provider. Let's say a $100 reimbursement for a 2D mammography scan, for example. It varies and can actually be much more depending on whether it's a routine screening or diagnostic testing, but we're going to say $100. But if there's no specific code for a given procedure, there's no reimbursement for the facility.
Right now, the 3D exam may not be covered by insurance and could involve an additional $50 to $75 fee.
So hospitals are forced to either eat the cost, bill the patient separately, or use a vague, unlisted procedure code, which usually means no reimbursement, and thus no incentive for that facility to perform that procedure or buy a new piece of technology. And from 2011 until 2015, there was no CPT code for 3D mammograms. Even using the 3D Tomo unit, it could only be billed as 2D mammogram plus, quote, unlisted procedure, which resulted in the exact same $100 reimbursement they would have gotten if they'd only done the 2D scan. But as of January 1st, 2015, when a patient came in for a mammogram and was scanned by a Hologic Dimensions, they'd get a 3D scan, which, as I mentioned, also produces a 2D image, and the hospital could bill 2 codes. The 2D mammo imaging code they'll be reimbursed $100 for, and now the 3D mammo CPT code, which they'll receive an additional $57 reimbursement for, totaling $157 per scan with Hologic. Multiply that by the hundreds of scans a busy department could do in a week, and in early 2015, Hologic was the only FDA-approved tomo on the market in the US. So when the reimbursable code was created specifically for 3D mammography, it was built for Hologic's technology, and now hospitals would get reimbursed extra by using Hologic's one machine, making the dimensions the obvious choice. A competitor couldn't just show up the next day and say, "We do 3D too." They'd need their own FDA approval, their own clinical data, and now they were entering a market where hospitals had already bought Hologic machines specifically because that reimbursement had worked. Hologic had first mover advantage into 3D, years of running unopposed. They had research-backed studies supporting their effectiveness, and now a reimbursement incentivizing hospitals to buy from them. In 2024, Siemens struck back. The latest addition to their tomosynthesis line, the MammoMat B Brilliant, was granted FDA approval. It features 50-degree wide-angle acquisition for their scans, the widest on the market, beating the dimensions, which only sweeps a narrow 15 degrees in comparison. GE partnered with RadNet and integrated their Deep Health AI software directly into the Pristina line of tomo units, now boasting a 23% increase in cancer detection rates. But Hologic?
Now, yeah, it's official. Blackstone TBG, they're going to pay $79, up to $79 a share for Hologic. And yeah, classic leveraged buyout here.
In April 2026, Hologic was officially purchased by private equity firms Blackstone and TPG, paying out their shareholders and delisting it from the NASDAQ. So the company that built its empire on being first to innovate has suddenly created a world of uncertainty. It took Hologic 15 years to build a lead this big, 4 years ahead on hardware, 6 years ahead on 3D, and a billing code that quietly locked in hospitals already using their machines. The only thing left to find out is whether Hologic's new owners keep that trajectory going, or whether Siemens and GE can finally overtake the position they've spent more than a decade working to close in on.